that we can encourage the overall field. But our drive is to we're dedicated to creating those workplaces where people can thrive and employers can reward and that behavior, and your clients will love overall. So that's our big drive here. So today we're going to be talking with Viktoria, but let me introduce our host real quick. Heather is not with us today. She was having some system issues earlier. And so we have Howard joining us once again. Howard's a very seasoned compensation expert for over like a 25-year track history of advising firms in the financial industry, such as Barclays, JP Morgan, and so forth. So we're really pleased to have Howard as one of our panelists here. And then also Viktoria Kiseleva. So Viktoria, I know that there's a lot of, we're going to go and dive a little bit more into your history and so forth, but very pleased to have your expertise here talking about sales compensation and also just incentive plans and on how to look at them overall if they're on and off track. And so that's going to be our topic today. So as a run-of-the-mill course, I mean, we are on broadcasting here live on Zoom. And so if you happen to be on the Zoom platform, you can go ahead and leave questions in the chat, and we'll be monitoring that throughout the conversation today. And if you happen to be on another platform, because we are broadcasting this through multiple channels, LinkedIn and Facebook and Twitter. If you happen to be on one of those channels, just go ahead and leave and comment where you're at, and we'll catch that later. And if we don't cover it during the discussion today, but feel free to leave your comments there. So looking forward to the discussion. So Viktoria, so tell us a little bit about yourself. I mean, how did you get involved or started into compensation, and what really drove your passion here?
Yeah, so I'll give you a little bit on my background. So obviously I'm a compensation consultant and I specialize in sales incentive design and effectiveness. And I've been a consultant at large companies externally and internally, as well as I've worked in-house in a variety of industries, and now I'm part of Comp Team. And so in my experience, I've worked with companies of all shapes and sizes, with sales forces as large as 20,000 incumbents or as little as team of one, for example, really in a variety of industries. So I've worked in tech and telecom, healthcare, insurance, fast-moving consumer goods, industrial products. And so obviously happy to be here and talk about SIP effectiveness and share my experience with you all. But in terms of what got me into comp consulting, I will admit it was a little bit random. I had a good friend that worked in the industry that was telling me about, how the type of work that she does. And my background is actually in industrial engineering. So it's all about process improvement and systems improvement. And I just found, the work really fascinating because it's really sort of the connection between obviously the business objectives and goals, as well as the people that are on the front lines. So it's really impactful and no project is the same. So I've had a great time so far.
That's great. I know that's one of the things that I love about compensation is that we're really impacting people's lives. And so finding ways to ensure that pay is not something that they have to worry about, that they're paid competitively, that they're being rewarded for their performance and contributions to the company, and they can just focus on their passions, what they love to do the most, and giving them that freedom. I love that as part of my career. So I'm right with you there. So, but as we look at some of these companies, I mean, so there's so many great startups that are beginning business and are starting to sell products and to the marketplace and are beginning to think about how they can put together incentive plans that attract and retain more higher powered talent and that better seasoned talent that they're trying to attract to their company. And so when you're thinking about those firms that are just starting to put together a plan, what are the first things that they have to think about?
Yeah, well, of course, if you're looking to, this is obvious, but if you're looking to generate revenue as a company, right, you should have a plan. And so the complexity of your plan will obviously depend on the maturity of your company, the market you operate in, and even how established your roles are. So if you have little insight into how you're going to perform, have no idea how to set targets, it's better to start out with a simple plan such as a commission plan. If you don't have clearly defined roles, for example, and this is very common in startups, right, where everybody does a little bit of everything, it's also better to have a more simple plan. Obviously, as you evolve as an organization, you start getting more established, in your roles and your processes. That's when you can start, putting in more specific, role-specific plans that are really optimal for what your incumbents are doing day to day. Because a generic plan will work initially, but eventually, like I said, once you start evolving, it's not optimal. And Sam, we've seen this a number of times, right? So where you have plans that are essentially a one size fits all, and though it's something that's very easy to administrate, at least in theory, it doesn't drive the optimal behavior, right? Because you have
Totally agree.
roles, you have your account managers are all getting paid, the same commission rate. And a lot of the time they don't even get exposure to account managers, for example, get exposure to clients, right? They don't actually have selling influence. And so their plan really isn't suited for their role, and it doesn't drive behavior, and it can lead to a variety of things, obviously, like retention issues, the company not meeting their financial objectives, obviously, and frankly, a lot of the time it's just wasted money if you don't have an optimal plan for the roles.
That's right. And then when you're first starting out, that's a scarce resource is the funding, right? So that's an often problem. So, but as you mentioned, simple is better. It's definitely, especially when you're beginning. And but then you need to know when it's time to evolve the plan, and to remove that one size fits all plan to something that's going to be specific. And so, what are some of the things that we have to look at as a company know it's time to start evolving the plan? You mentioned one thing as far as there's early on, a lot of companies are wearing multiple hats, right? I mean, the incumbents are doing a lot of different jobs in the company. Is it time to kind of evolve to multiple plans when we start seeing a little bit more specialization? What do you think?
Right, exactly. And that's what I was alluding to when I mentioned, once you start having more established roles. So, I mentioned it in my bio that I've worked with companies as small as one salesperson, right? So that salesperson is obviously responsible for new business. They're responsible for business development, for retention, everything under the sun. So they tend to have a more generic plan. But as you start maturing as an organization and getting a more established and structured sales force, where you have dedicated resource for business development, for sales, your folks that are hunting new business specifically, your account managers, your customer care reps, that's when it's time to really start making sure that the plans are reflective of the nature of the role. And really that's in everybody's benefit, right? It's in your benefit as a company to make sure that you're getting optimal results out of your employees. And then of course that you're paying for the efforts of your salespeople appropriately to avoid retention issues and everything else. And
right. So,
I have a question. Should the plans be specific to the person or to the role? How do you avoid having 10,000 different plans for each individual?
Right. So to the extent possible, they should be specific to the role. You really don't want to have people-specific plans because, what happens when a person leaves and you have to replace them, for example, right? Are you going to start over and redesign a plan for them? There's different ways to differentiate pay and performance individually, and that should be through your total target comp. And obviously your plan should pay for performance where individual efforts are rewarded appropriately. But the plan structure should be consistent by role to the extent possible. Because if not, it can create all kinds of issues, including issues in pay differentiation, right? If you have your peer who finds out, well, why are you in a different plan than I am? It can result in legal issues as well. So you really just don't want to go down that road if you don't have to. But what we see a lot is somebody may have a plan in place that's been around for 3 or 4 years, and it started out as a 1 or 2 person sales force, and eventually they add on more folks. And so they might have a legacy plan and they may have a new plan, so you get kind of this little bit of a jumbled mess where you get companies that don't want to change the plans of those more senior folks because they worry about retention, all kinds of stuff, and you have to make the change. So there's different ways, like I said, to ensure that those folks stick around. You can adjust what their comp package looks like, but the plan, to the extent possible, if it is the same role, should be the same across all incumbents within role.
Yeah, one thing that I've seen, especially with small startups, as they start looking at something, a new plan. It's common that a lot of them will start out when they maybe have 4 or 5 people, and they're just they put an incentive plan together that encompasses in everyone, basically in the entire firm, and they're just basing it on growth or performance and so forth. And you might have some people are dedicated to sales and some that are not in sales at all. And some those that are in sales the plan may not have a whole lot of upside because you're uncertain about the market. I mean, you're really, in a business development mode, you're building the marketplace. There's not a whole lot of upside, but then you start seeing that the product starts taking off. You need to have people more focused on that sales role. And to be able to be more market competitive, you need to have a plan with more headroom, more upside, more chances to have higher levels of variable pay. But then, of course, if you have that legacy plan where everybody's eligible for that plan, that doesn't quite make sense. You're paying way too much for those that shouldn't be on the plan. So then the question of who should be on the plan and who shouldn't be on the plan comes into place. And so when we're talking about eligibility, what are the things that you're seeing, Victoria, as far as companies struggling with?
Yeah, so in terms of eligibility for a sales incentive plan itself, obviously it depends on things like sales influence, right? So are you actually client facing? Can you actually influence a sale? Are you a direct seller? If not, maybe a sales incentive plan isn't the best thing for you to have. Maybe you should have more of an MBO plan. So a lot of the time, the professional population within a company, so including, your finance folks, your marketing folks, they may have some sort of an incentive plan as well. That's normally based on company performance. In some instances, MBO, which is management by objectives, right? Where you may have certain predefined criteria that you're looking to meet as a team or an individual, and they normally pay on an annual basis. But to the extent possible, if you're a direct seller, if you're responsible for generating revenue, you want to make sure that those folks do have an sales incentive plan in place. And so it starts getting actually, it's a lot easier to distinguish between actual frontline salespeople and the rest of the company. But as you start moving up the sales chain, so your managers, your directors, for example, that's when it starts getting a little bit hazy, because a lot of the time, they may not have a contact with clients, for example, they're not customer facing, but they are driving the results of the team through coaching, right? So it really just depends on the nature of the manager or the director role. Typically, once you get past, in larger organizations, for example, past the director, senior director role, you move towards more of a either, MBO-based plan or even an LTI-based plan, long-term incentives, because, you're so far removed from being client-facing that you're really responsible for driving strategy, obviously sales strategy and setting sales goals, but you don't actually get rewarded for sales specifically, because by that time you're 3 or 4 levels up from your actual frontline people.
Should be doing more coaching. So I know the whole basis of our conversation today is because of what's been happening for the past few years, the pandemic and so forth. A lot of businesses have been put into shock. The sales cycle, the way they do business, the way that employees are interacting with customers, and also internally or externally has changed. And so what are the red flags that we need to think about that show that, hey, we need to reevaluate our incentive plan, our sales plan to make changes? What are some of the red flags that you see, Viktoria?
Yeah, so common red flag is obviously a misalignment between company goals and plan metrics. So if you're a margin-based business, for example, let's say you're in resales and you measure on revenue, obviously that's a red flag. But also this applies not only to the metrics, but the type of business that you're after, right? So if you're looking to grow as a company, maybe the most optimal thing for you to do is, to separate out how you reward new business and recurring revenue. So whereas if you're focused on retention, we saw that shift and that trend quite a bit over the past year and a half. Folks were less focused on acquiring a new business. They wanted to make sure that they can at least hold on to their client base, right? Your plan should reflect that. And so, if you have certain strategic products that tend to drive more stickiness with your customers, for example, you should consider incentivizing those at a higher rate than the rest of your products, because, in that case, not all revenue is the same. And so making sure that you have constant alignment between what you're trying to achieve as an organization, and that it trickles all the way down to how you measure your sales folks is huge. And so, we saw that really emphasized with the pandemic over the past year and a half already, but it happens on smaller scales, all the time. So companies will shift their strategy, but they'll say, well, our plan's not broken, right? Nothing's on fire, so we can keep our commission plan or whatever and keep chugging along. And so, and that's actually something that, we see quite a bit because it's very easy to tell when, a plan's on fire and it's just not working. It's a little more challenging to say, okay, well, your plan's not terrible, it's not necessarily broken, but it's certainly not optimal. There's tend to be sort of, the sneakier cases, and that's actually most of the projects that, we work on. So you just want to make sure that you keep a thumb on, what it is that we're looking to achieve and what are we actually measuring. So, I always tell my clients that somebody should be able to look at your plan and everything down from the measures that you have in place all the way down to the payout frequency, and, be able to tell what are you looking to achieve. And so if it's not easy to do so, then maybe it's time to, reevaluate
right,
because it's not reflective optimally of your strategy.
We received a question from one of the participants. They're asking how to differentiate when there's a plan applicable for a sales territory and all linked to the sales territory receive the same reward.
Right. So if I'm understanding the question correctly, this should depend on, a lot of the time this can be accounted for the plan by plan type, for example. So let me make sure I'm understanding this. Plan applicable for sales territory.
I think the question is, if everyone's tied to the goals for the sales territory, how do you differentiate if everyone's going to be receiving the same reward? And maybe that's just the problem, that you need to have further differentiation.
So one thing that, as Viktoria is reading that, and what I see is a common issue is that when you have different sales areas and those different sales areas come with different product penetration. It might be way easier to be able to sell a particular product in one area versus another. And so the effort that's required is different. And so how do you make those areas, fair,
Right.
and I think some of that has to do with the plan design.
Yeah, exactly. And so, when you think about the plan types, probably the most common ones are commission-based plan, right? Where pretty much everybody's familiar with that. You have a certain rate that pays out on revenue or volume or units or whatever. And then you have a quota-based type, which basically says, here's your target and your performance against the target dictates your payout. And so that's a plan that works really well for different types of territories, right? Because not all territories are the same. As we know, some may have more new business opportunity, others may have, a strictly focus on retaining clientele. And so a quota-based plan works really well for those types of scenarios because you're able to adjust quota that's reflective of your territory's potential, and then you pay on effort based on that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good point. And it's a great question because there's and during the pandemic, or because of the pandemic, there's been a lot of issues such as supply chain and so forth. So you might have certain industries or certain locations where it's tough to get product into because of the limited supply. Maybe more cost effective for your company to ship things more locally than it is to ship it to across the country where you have to take on a lot of other burdens of cost and when you have limited supply of your product. And so that'll impact your salespeople that service those areas. And how do you so tell us, Victoria, what are ways of in a situation where you have a limited amount of supply for a particular region, how would you readjust the plan to keep that salesperson engaged when they only have, let's say, half as many units that they can sell in that location?
Right. Yeah. And that's something that, Sam, like you mentioned, we've seen quite a bit over the past year and a half specifically. And so I will say one thing not to do is to cut pay, right? So especially if you have a commission-based plan and you're paid per units, because there's not enough supply, in theory that their pay potential goes down quite significantly, right? And in your example, it would even have. But so what you have to do is, you keep the target pay the same, but you have to start shifting what you're measuring folks on. So, if you can't measure on sales past a certain point, you have to start thinking of, what are other things that, we can occupy them that will contribute to business results, whether it's, qualitative things like coaching teams, making calls to clients, things like that. That are not necessarily sales related. You basically have to start shifting, the measures to make sure that, they're still performance based and give folks opportunity to earn their full earning potential.
Right. I mean, the big intent here is that you don't want to, if you're used to selling 100 units in a particular location and now you can only sell 50, you don't want that person to sell 50 and then to take the rest of the year off, right? It's important to keep them engaged, keep them talking to those clients that are frustrated, that want your product, that cannot have it at this time, setting expectations for the future, and building that base, keeping demand for your product, but also setting expectations so they know when they are going to be able to achieve it. And then, as you mentioned, Victoria, sharing the knowledge so that the rest of the business can scale and grow, and using that downtime for in positive ways that's going to leverage the business going forward.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you can start measuring them on activity-based measures. So maybe it's potential leads that are interested in the product that just aren't able to get it right away. So things like that to the extent possible are still relevant to the sales role and the day-to-day responsibilities that obviously account for the supply challenges. So it's tricky, but
Yeah.
Would there be a discretionary element, or should it all be formulaic?
Yeah, it depends on the situation. In theory, and ideally, to the extent possible, it's better to measure folks on something that's more formulaic, right? So just because, salespeople are essentially where the rubber meets the road for the entire organization, right? So you want to make sure that you're actually paying them for financial efforts to the extent possible. You can include strategic efforts as well if necessary, but when it comes to discretionary components, that should probably be the smallest weight of a measure in a plan, because there's a lot of complications that play into it, right? There's the differences in managers, for example. When the less structured a measure is, the more there's room for error, and you really don't want to see that with sales. Yeah.
So I think that you're right. I mean, it should be a smaller percentage of the plan. It may be necessary given to some of the uncertainty in the marketplace right now, to where you need to have more discretionary elements such as an MBO type of measurements and so forth. But yeah, I mean, when we say smaller, it still means meaningful, right? I mean, that's a big mistake a lot of companies make is they go, oh, what does small mean? Is that 10%? Is that 5%? And I would say that those elements you're getting at, when you're getting down to 10%, you're like that as part of an overall earning opportunity. You're looking at incentives that are not that meaningful as a component. And so what do people do? They ignore it. So it's important that you, even though it's a smaller component, that it's still a meaningful amount based on what your payouts look like.
We typically don't recommend anything below 20% on a measure in an incentive plan, because of the reasons that you just listed. Because at that point, it just creates administrative complexity, right? Especially if you pay out frequently, if you pay out on weekly or monthly basis, the amount is going to be so insignificant that you really aren't driving behavior by even having the metric in place. It's more so just an administrative burden for you, and it doesn't drive behavior, like I said.
Yeah, that's another point of keeping plans simple, right? Where you don't want to have so many measures to where that it's dilutive, to where it doesn't focus behavior. So another thing I want to bridge on that's resulting from the pandemic, Viktoria, is the fact that how work is done has changed. And so there's been companies where they've used to, the sales department's been more individualistic, and then people basically having their own quota and so forth. And then now they're coming into a situation where that has shifted a bit, and there's more of a team element of how they do work. So this is another area where I'm seeing that companies need to reevaluate. What are you seeing in that space?
Yeah, right on. So I think, as we've had shifts in the measures and strategies over the past year and a half specifically, we've also seen shifts in the level of contribution as well. And so obviously, when you should measure folks on individual contribution, especially salespeople, right? If you have high performing sales folks, they want to be paid for their efforts. A lot of the time, putting them on a team-based plan is discouraging, but at times, as far as temporary solutions that we've seen over the past year and a half as well, that has to be done. And a lot of this stems from, administrative complexities. If you're putting somebody on a team-based measure, maybe you just don't have visibility into what they can do individually, what they actually contribute individually. And so you have no other choice but, measure them on as a team. But it's not preferred by any means. Obviously there's some scenarios where it makes sense. We've seen some companies where, their roles are, and this is very common in smaller companies as well, where they wear multiple hats, right? So you can have somebody who acts both as a lead generator, a closer, customer service rep as well. They're assigned to specific accounts. And so, if it's a smaller team working together, then obviously, you really can't tell who took what call a lot of the time, or who closed what deal or answered what email. And so you have to put them on a team-based plan. But so, a lot of the time the administrative hurdle is what leads to team-based plans. But like I said, to the extent possible, you want to keep them individual.
Mm-hmm.
We have another question that was submitted. As the world is moving towards more technology-based value selling concept, do we see a shift from commission-based plans to quota-based plans?
Yeah, so I would say this isn't necessarily specific to the selling concept itself. It's more so about, what the appropriate plan structure is for you. And that depends on, how for a quota, for example, like I mentioned earlier, it depends on how comfortable you are with quota setting. So, if you're a smaller organization, you have no idea how well you're going to perform. If you're just starting out, you have no idea how to set targets, then it's better to stick with a commission-based plan, because in the case that you miss your quota or you assign a target inappropriately, that's going to cause all kinds of issues, right? Because a sales rep is going to get discouraged. For example, if you have an annual quota and then, 3 months in, they are figuring out, oh, well, there's no way I could ever perform at this level. They're just going to give up, basically, because a lot of the time quota-based plans have thresholds in them. And so if you don't meet a certain level of performance, you don't get paid anything. And so as soon as they get, a line of sight into the fact that, hey, there's no way I'm going to be able to attain this, they're just, going to stop putting in effort, basically. And so, that's obviously a risk, but, quota plans work really well in situations where there's differences in territory sizes, for example, like I mentioned earlier, and also for more mature companies where they actually are more confident in the way that, they can set their targets. Whereas commission, the downside of commission is that it doesn't really provide a level of expectation when it comes to performance, because, you're paid as you go, whether it's on revenue or particular units. And so, if a rep decides, hey, okay, I'm good in terms of my incentive pay for the month, they may stop selling, or if they go on vacation or something like that, right? So that's the other nice thing about quotas, is that you have a certain level of performance expectation that a rep has to work towards and meet before they get their pay. So that's really more so, it depends sort of on where you are as a sales force and what market you operate in, how mature it is, how well you're able to grasp, your target setting confidence, basically, not necessarily, the types of products that you're selling.
How do you encourage contributions to the team if you have a very individualistic commission plan? Isn't that difficult to achieve?
Yeah, well, you have to, if you expect the salesperson or whoever to contribute to the team, then you need to measure them on it, basically. And so we actually see this a lot with managerial roles. So I've come across quite a few instances where a manager, for example, or a director has both an individual component. So they're a player coach, so to speak, right? They sell, they're client facing, but they also coach a team. And so that can get a little bit tricky, because if the incentive opportunity that you're providing to a manager or a director is higher for their individual efforts, that's where they're going to focus on. And so obviously that's not preferred for somebody who's supposed to be a people leader. So you want to make sure that the behavior that you're expecting out of that person or that role is reflected in their plan appropriately. And so, and vice versa, if you're looking for somebody to contribute to the team performance, a lot of the time you may have a star rep, and they've been doing an excellent job on their individual performance, and if you really want them to start, coaching fellow teammates, things like that, well, you have to incentivize them for it, right? Because otherwise they're going to keep trekking along with what pays their bills at the end of the day.
Yeah, I think in one way or the other, I think that there's situations where you can have you start developing a culture of helping each other and teamwork and so forth, and you're still in a individual sales environment. One thing that you can do is stay with your current incentive plan as in just focusing on those sales, but then offer certain types of recognition plans that recognize people that are working across the team and helping others be successful. That can be done through either recognition or even at times spot bonuses or so forth. But putting, of course, when you're trying to encourage teamwork, that can be somewhat of a discretionary element, as we talked about earlier. It's great to keep those to a minimum, and when it comes to pay, just from a fairness standpoint, because everybody is biased in one way or another on how they assess that qualitative behavior. So I often encourage recognition as being a good driver on influencing that. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. One other thing I wanted to mention as well is we're seeing things change in the market. There's as the pandemic has caused a lot of companies to expand their borders. I mean, they were once focused and nationally, and then now that they've expanded their online platform, and they found that they can expand their breadth, whether it's in services or product sales and so forth. Now, so there's some complications that I want to point out as far as taking your at-home or your national-based sales program and moving it international. So what are you seeing there, Victoria, as far as things you have to worry about?
Yeah, this is unfortunately sort of a case by case answer here, because there's just a lot of the time there's just so many different things going on, right? A lot of issues that stem from as you expand your services, for example, and your offerings, you're not able to track where a certain sale comes from, for example, right? And who's actually responsible for making it or closing it. So, and in turn, folks don't get credit for it. So it's been, it's sort of definitely a mystery, I would say.
And I'd have to say there's one other thing that I've seen is very common is like when you're in the US, for instance, you might have a highly leveraged plan. And then you just move that sales plan to a different location where that highly leveraged plan might not be appropriate, especially if they're doing more sales development or business development in that particular area, or they're more used to working in teams, even though they're selling the same product in the same process. The individual component may be different than the team component in that particular culture. Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. So I think that there's a couple industry or a couple countries that are specific to having more individualistic type of behaviors around the globe. I think those are typically, of course, the US and UK, and I think that. But there are some countries that there's less individualistic behavior and more team based. Would you say?
Yeah, absolutely, and this is really prominent and specifically in Asian cultures as well. So I had a client once actually it was a Japanese based company that had a manufacturing plant in Atlanta actually, and so they basically they had a lot of issues within the company culture because they just essentially have different expectations when it comes to contribution in sales, right? So in a lot of cultures, it's appropriate to just be paid base pay, even if you're a salesperson, whereas, in the US, for example, it's a lot more common to be rewarded specifically on your efforts. And so for really, driven and aggressive sales folks, base pay just isn't going to cut it, because a lot of the time, sales folks will go into sales because they want to be rewarded for their efforts. So, that creates sort of a clash in the company culture as well. And I will say it was probably one of the most difficult projects I've had to do. So
yeah, I think that's the important part, is really, as we expand into those new markets, is to take the time to understand, how the culture accepts or defines what drives that those sales in the long run. Is it should we be measuring the outcomes, such as those sales, which could take a longer period of time in some undeveloped markets, or should we be focusing more on behaviors? And I think that that's what we need to be conscientious of. Even if we're selling the same product in different locations, we need to think about how it gets done. Should we be focusing more on relationship building in certain areas, or we should be driving towards, how many times a person's being able to, pick up that phone and close a deal. So that it totally is, it can be different in different cultures, right?
Definitely.
So, and I think that, sorry, go ahead, Victoria.
I'm just going to say, it looks like we had a couple of questions come from Matt as well. So the first is, given the economic uncertainty, how often are quotas and targets typically revisited and potentially revised mid-year or more frequently? So I will say that this is something that, there isn't a hard and fast rule on how to approach this. This is something that a lot of companies struggle with. And, the short answer is, it just really depends. It depends on your sales cycle. It depends on how well you've been tracking to your expected performance, right? Obviously, if you feel like your plan and your performance is totally going off the rails, then you want to make adjustments as soon as possible, right? You don't want to wait half a year before revisiting your quotas. But at the same time, it's a balance, because the more you adjust the quotas, it can really impact how your sales folks perceive the plan, right? If you're constantly changing targets, then, to the extent that, they don't feel like there's consistency, and that's going to shift behavior and for the worse, right? And so you want to make sure that, and I would say probably the most common approach would be at least on quarterly basis, but in terms of adjustments, maybe every 6 months or so, but it just depends really on, like I said, your sales cycle and your situation.
That's a totally good point, Victoria. I mean, if you have like a long sales cycle, it's going to be difficult to change it in a short period of time. But if you're having, if your sales cycle is very short, I think that it's very important to look of your attainment measures, right? And so basically, how many people are actually achieving quota and meeting expectations?
Yeah.
And so what's the typical percentage that you'd like to see achieve quota, Victoria?
Yeah, so it's typically, you normally expect about 60 to 65% of your sales force at least hit or exceed your targets. And so we'll talk about performance distribution in a bit, but generally, if it's any less than that, then you may have some quota setting issues. If it's significantly greater than that, that maybe the quotas are too easy. So you definitely want to make sure on how you're keeping an eye out on how your population performs. But another thing I'll add to Maddie's question is that, not only can you shift quotas, but another thing that we see quite a bit is that you're actually shifting the payout scale. So for example, you may have a threshold, typically a threshold of 90%, right? So if a rep doesn't hit 90%, they don't get paid anything. And so because, their performance suffers because of the uncertainty that we have today, you can actually shift the scale itself. So you can shift the threshold down to 85%, for example. It obviously depends on how your sales force is trucking along with their performance. But that's another thing that you can do instead of adjusting quotas all the time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think one of the big things in times of uncertainty, when either you're entering a new market and something's new, or you just get, the market is shocked and you have supply chain problems like we're experiencing right now. I think if you're on a commission plan, and if there's a threshold in your plan, I think it's important to look at that threshold to ensure that at least 90% of your people are exceeding that threshold and being successful somewhere in the plan. If you have, if you're seeing that grow past, if you're seeing that people are not meeting that threshold, increase more than 10%, I think that's probably a red flag that you should consider making some adjustments, because it may be just difficult to really do any kind of sales in that environment. If we think about some of the things that have been going on, I mean, we've seen during the pandemic, as far as restaurants that are not able to operate, dry cleaners not being able to have any kind of flow through because people aren't going to the office, different things like that, where it's very difficult to encourage that sale or to drive revenue to the business. We need to look at our plans and make adjustments.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And before we get to the analytics, there's another question around clawbacks. So the question is, are you seeing an increased use of clawback provisions in commission-based plan given the impact of COVID on the amount of canceled or revised orders or purchases, or are companies changing to either less frequent payout or payouts only after final payments are actually received to deal with the risk of uncertainty in the economy? Are there legal issues to be aware of with commission clawbacks? And so the answer is, we're actually seeing both, I would say. So obviously, to the extent possible that you want to make sure that you're not utilizing the concept of clawbacks all the time. It's just not good, obviously, for anybody involved. It can it can really discourage the rep. You can have complications with getting obviously your payouts back. But in terms of legal issues, if it's something that's previously stated in your plan, right, that that's a concept that can be practiced, you shouldn't, in theory, have legal complications when it comes to clawbacks. And so, and it's actually, yeah, go ahead.
No, I think I would say is like, even though it's in your plan, should you do it? Especially, yeah. So it's like, yeah, we have a lot of flexibility. I mean, we try to make as a company, it's good to make those plans as flexible as possible so that they can handle any kind of issue. But in a time when we're looking at, everybody's under pressure, and a lot of companies are delivering, more pay, more secured pay to their people as a way of retaining them, as a way of helping them through the crisis, and also as a way of saying thank you. I mean, we're seeing less concerns around taking money off the table or taking money away from employees. Now, there are some situations where there's been plans that have been blown out of the water because of the pandemic. I mean, there's been a lot of those that have suffered, and some of those that have really achieved, and such as those IT services and so forth that have taken on. But I've seen more companies act through generosity in these situations as a way, because these are stories that live on forever. It's like, hey, do you remember how my company took care of me during the pandemic? Yes, it was a crazy year. We had we had these huge gains where we didn't expect those, and I was able to be successful during that time. It'll help them bridge those times when it's the opposite, and it'll bring more trust and faith to that company.
Putting recent experience behind, are companies moving though to only paying out the reps when payment is booked, when the revenues are received?
Yeah, it depends. I mean, even it obviously depends on the type of product that you're selling, but even if you think about like going to the store, for example, and buying a dress, and a person is paid commission on the sale, right? And then you bring it back, in theory, that's subtracted from their pay as well, right? So it just depends, unfortunately, but it's not uncommon to subtract, or to act with sort of like minor clawbacks throughout the sales cycle. And so we've even seen instances where for margin-based businesses, for example, if they buy a product and it essentially results in negative margin, that's subtracted from their commission plan. So it's not that they get zero, they actually get the negative margin percentage of whatever it is that they bought that they couldn't resell. So like Sam said, it just depends really on the company culture and the situation. And so, people.
No, sorry to interrupt you. I mean, I was just going to say, yes, I totally agree. I mean, it's just the nature of talking about sales compensation is that it's different for every company that have just different products and industries and so forth. Sorry about interrupting you there, Victoria. Go ahead.
No, that's all. Do we want to go back to the example analytics and walk through those?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I think that's a nice screen to finish off on. So here, I know we just have a few more minutes to the top of the hour, but let's walk through some of these common analytics here.
Yeah. So in terms of, evaluating the plan effectiveness itself, right, there's sort of two components to it. So there's the qualitative piece, which is essentially getting feedback from plan participants and your leadership, right? And that's something that we always do as part of the first phase of the sales incentive design process. We go through an assessment stage, and the first is the qualitative portion, where we essentially schedule calls with leadership. We'll talk to finance, we'll talk to sales, we'll talk to marketing to make sure that everybody's on the same page in terms of what the plan is looking to achieve. So, if that's something that you can do, that's great to make sure everybody's aligned. And obviously, you can hear, you'll probably hear a lot of noise about the program regardless from the sales folks themselves, because salespeople are really not so shy when it comes to sharing their opinion. But the nice thing about having a quantitative portion to it is that you can validate a lot of the noise that you hear through actual data, right? So sometimes you'll have a conversation with a sales leader that says, well, our salespeople aren't achieving, they're not hitting their targets, the quotas are too high, and so they're not paid well. And then you look at the actual data and you see that, well, hey, your performance distribution actually looks pretty good. So it's important to, use the two as a complementary approach and not rely on just one, because, just having conversations doesn't capture everything, and just looking at data doesn't capture everything either. And so in terms of the quantitative portion, there's a variety of things that you can do that are really specific to that should be specific to what you're trying to achieve. But in terms of some of the most common ones that I'll go through here, is the first on the left is total target comp in comparison to total cash comp. So essentially what this looks at is, how does your actual payout compare to what you had budgeted for your reps? And so normally you want to look at this in a variety of components. You want to look at base, you want to look at the actual measures to see where there is misalignment, or, if a certain measure isn't generating pay for reps, for example, but you have it in place. So we talked about having, a smaller weight, for example. Is it really worth even you having that in the plan? So that will, shine through in these comparisons. And then it's a very simple, just a bar graph chart where you can look at the two side by side. And so, when you design an incentive plan, setting target comp should be its own step, right? So the sales plan itself is a function of how sales folks are paid. A lot of the time, there's confusion around, well, we have this plan and we don't really know how much people are going to get paid, because we don't know how well they're going to perform, things like that. And so that's sort of, to the extent possible where you can avoid it, you should establish how much we're going to pay our salespeople before rolling out a plan, right? A plan is just a way for people to get to the pay, which is, sort of the destination here. And then the second is the pay mix comparison. So target versus actuals. It's right in the middle of the page here. And so for those of you that don't know, pay mix is essentially the proportion of base pay to incentive pay. And so, that depends totally on, or incentive pay is pay at risk. So how much of an incentive you should have in your overall pay mix depends on the role itself, right? So if it's a hunter-like role that are really responsible for generating new business, they're aggressive, they should have more pay at risk because they can directly influence their pay results. Whereas if it's like a customer service rep that isn't really, revenue generating, then it's worth it to give them like a smaller pay incentives. Something like a mix of 9 to 10, for example, is very common. And so the reason that you want to compare the targets with actuals is because you really get a nice summary of sort of the role itself, right? So if you see significant deltas, I would say, 10% plus in the shifts between targets and actuals, well, that can be almost a different role, and if it's 20%, for example, there's a large difference between having a 60-40 and an 80-20. That's a totally different role. And so if you see, more emphasis on base pay, then then you can tell, hey, maybe this person isn't performing where they should be, right? Especially if it's a target-based plan, you can tell that they're not hitting their target pay, therefore they're not hitting their level of incentive portion. And so, that's a red flag. And then on the right-hand side, we have pay versus performance. So this is just a quick correlation graph. Essentially, you're comparing your incentive payout to your performance. And this in particular is for a quota-based plan, but you can also do this for commission-based plans, where you can compare, for example, revenue, dollar values, and for the commission that's paid for the reps itself. And so in this example, it's a scatter graph and you see a small value of about 0.2, right? The R-squared value, the regression value. So in theory, you want this to be a nice linear line, right? You want to have a direct correlation for pay and performance. And so anything with values above 0.7, I believe, is a good indicator that you have a pretty strong correlation. Mm-hmm. And then the other two, we briefly talked about performance distribution. On the left-hand side, it's a nice bell-shaped curve. You want to make sure that at least 60 to 65% of your folks are hitting their targets. If not, if it's skewed the other way, either way, maybe the quotas are too easy or their quotas are too hard. So you want to keep an eye out for that. And then compensation cost of sale, really it's really sort of an internal metric to keep an eye out. It's essentially the comparison between the revenue a rep generates and how much you're actually paying them. And so you want to make sure that those numbers, aren't abnormal and that they're consistent time over time. So there isn't really an industry best practice for compensation cost of sale. It is typical to have higher CCOS for technology-based companies, for example. It can be as high as 20%, but obviously the more mature you become as an organization, the lesser your cost of sale should be. And you want to make sure that you're actually paying appropriately, whether it's by role, by product type. So it's something that you'd like to consider as well.
Great. Thanks, Victoria. Well, I know we are at the top of the hour. Do we have any last question that we can take? We've gone through all of them on the list there. Yep. All right, great. Well, thank you, everyone. And thank you, Victoria, for putting this together for us. I thought that really, I love these graphs and what they can tell you. I mean, it's great that we're showing elements of how aligned we are with pay and performance. I mean, if you have a scatter graph that is is definitely dispersed and not towards your performance line, then you should be questioning things. And then just, looking at simple attainment, are people actually hitting the goals that we set for them, as far as are they achieving the pay that is at target for this role? I mean, it's fair for us to, when we're setting out, when we're hiring a person for a sales role or any other role for that matter, giving them an expectation of what they should be paid is important. And if their sales plan is preventing them from achieving those in an unjust way, then we need to look at how we need to adjust that plan so that it delivers that promise to our people, so that they will continue to stay with us and perform. So these are hopefully some of these analytics that will be helpful for some of our listeners out there. So thank you very much, Viktoria.
I was going to say one thing I didn't touch on is just pay differentiation, and that's basically that graph below pay and performance. And this is just to make sure that your highest performers are getting paid as they should be, meaning the slope shouldn't be consistent, right? If you look at performance as an x-axis, you don't want to see a consistent, one-to-one slope. You want to make sure it's curved a bit up to the right, because that's when your top performers are seeing the most significant pay differentiation. So after they hit their quotas, they're able to be paid out more generously, because now they've started to exceed the expectations, and you want to make sure that you're rewarding for that as well. And that's something that really high performing sales reps work for.
That's right. Great. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today and for another Rewards Mastermind. And we look forward to seeing you next month. All right. Thanks, Viktoria, once again.
Thank you. Take care.
All right. Everyone, take care. Bye.